Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be able to have the chance to tell you all in more detail the work that I'm doing here at SESYNC. So as most of you probably know, that my work is on endangered species, which I think are actually a great example of a socio-environmental system that requires synthesis research approaches to study. So some background on the Endangered Species Act. It was enacted in 1973. So this year is actually the 40th anniversary of the act. It was initially intended to be a program for the conservation of the species, and also, in addition to that, recovery of the species, so that protections of the act are no longer required. So currently there are over 1,400 species that are now listed as either endangered or threatened, and that includes 619 that are animal species, and the remaining are plant species. Just to give you an idea of how much it costs for the ESA to be implemented, based on the past 5 most recent years of reported expenditure, it's actually cost $1.46 billion per year to implement ESA. That number seems huge to me, but apparently it's spread across both federal and state agencies, including 30 federal agencies, including those in the Department of Defense, Department of Commerce, which includes NOAA, the National Marine Fisheries Service, which manages the marine species, and also the Department of Interior, which includes the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they manage all of the remaining species. And that includes basically 95% of all of the U.S. listed species. So the Fish and Wildlife Service really is the major implementer in terms of management of the species. And in terms of their budget for the last 5 years, they reported a budget of $162 million per year. And so that means that even though they manage most of the species, their budget is actually a small percentage of the cost, relatively speaking. And so that means that many of the species are actually not getting a lot of funding for management. So there are 5 major provisions of the ESA, and I'll just quickly go through each of them. So first is listing. A species can be added to the endangered species list through 2 different processes. One is the petition process, which any concerned individual or party can initiate, or through the candidate assessment process, which is initiated by the Fish and Wildlife Service, or NOAA. But mostly I'm going to be focusing on the service, so you'll hear me mostly talking about the Fish and Wildlife Service's work. And so, for example, the greater sage grouse is currently being considered for listing, so it's a candidate species. And again, species can be listed as endangered or threatened, and endangered is defined as species that are in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. Threatened species are legally defined as those that are likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future. Okay, a second provision is the prohibition of take. So take is legally defined as that quote up there, includes harassing, harming, pursuing, hunting, shooting, all of those activities. And any of those activities are prohibited for listed species. And interestingly, that applies to all listed animal species under all circumstances. However, for plants, you're only not allowed to take plants from federal lands. So it's interesting. Critical habitat may be designated for a species at the time of listing. And the purpose of that is to identify areas that are considered essential for the conservation of the listed species. Interestingly, even though listed species are protected wherever they occur, critical habitat can be designated to include areas where the species does not currently occupy. And so that is somewhat controversial. Additionally, this is the only part of the Endangered Species Act where economic impacts must be explicitly considered. So for example, this is the Barrier Island map of the critical habitat for the polar bear. The polar bear was listed as threatened in 2008, and its final ruling for the critical habitat designation didn't come out until the end of 2010. And part of the reason for that delay is because of the economic impacts assessment. It took a long time. And also the process involved peer review process and also a public commenting process that just took a long time.
So can areas be prevented from being protected because of economic interests, and does the judge have to decide that, or who makes that decision?
The service makes the decision, but the judicial process could come into play if parties sue the service for their decisions. And so they base their decisions on, I think the way they define it is that the benefits of including an area has to outweigh the benefits of excluding an area. So it's a very interesting way that they say it. But maybe it's because the cost of excluding it might be difficult. I'm not sure. So yeah, so that is also a controversial issue. So for the polar bear, in the end, what they determined in the critical habitat designation is that they considered, in terms of economic impacts, the oil and gas exploration, general development, U.S. Coast Guard activities in the area, and also Native communities that occur in the area. And in the end, they decided to exclude the areas where the Native communities are because they determined the benefits of working with those communities would be better for improving the conservation of the species than to include those areas for critical habitat. Okay, and then one other thing about critical habitat is that it really only affects the federal projects that occur on the critical habitats. And so what that means is that any federal agency proposing to do a project that might either occur on or impact the critical habitat, then they must consult with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about those projects to make sure they get approval. And so interagency consultation is another provision of the Act. By law, all of the federal agencies are required to aid in the conservation of this species, and also they have responsibility not to jeopardize the continued existence of the species or destroy or adversely modify the habitat. And so any activity or project that are found to violate these have to be modified so that they comply. Okay, and finally, the service is required to complete a recovery plan for each of the listed species. And the recovery plans must contain at least two things. One is the management actions that are site-specific and determine what actions are going to be taken to preserve these species. And then secondly, they're required to have objective measurable criteria, which when met, then the species can be up for delisting. So the criteria usually come in the form of either the number of individuals or the number of populations that the species must have before the service determines it to be a viable species. And at which point then you can be removed from the list. Okay, so that was just a quick overview of all of these 5 major provisions of the Act. Currently, each of these provisions are handled separately by a different program within the service, and they may or may not work together on their decisions, even though they may be working on the same species. Additionally, much of the decisions made by the Fish and Wildlife Service regarding these different provisions, but in particular the listing decisions, the critical habitat decisions, and the recovery planning decisions they've all been criticized for being not based on the best available science.
Are there any other agencies besides NIST within NOAA and Fish and Wildlife that have to do recovery plans?
Mm-mm.
No,
Those
just
are the only two, yep. Yeah. So yeah, they are the major implementers of management. So yeah, but by law, the ESA requires that these decisions should be based on the best available science. And so because of all the money that is spent on these processes, it's really important that we understand how and to what extent science is coming into play in this process so that they can be defensible. Okay, so in terms of listing, critics of the ESA have proposed that maybe they should follow the system that's being used by the IUCN, which is the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And they have their own red list of threatened and endangered species, which is a broader list. It includes all species internationally, whereas the Endangered Species Act protects mostly US species. And the proponents of the IUCN system say that it is basically a little more scientifically defensible, a little more quantitative. And so I'll just contrast those two for you. Basically, the way that the ESA lists species, they use what's called a 5-factor analysis, and each of those bullet points is one of their factors. And it's mostly a threat-based assessment process. So for example, whether a species is threatened by disease or predation. So species that are found to be threatened by any one of these 5 factors can be listed as either endangered or threatened. So only one is required, but usually for any given species, it can be more than one. In contrast, the IUCN system is more of a demography-based system. It's a lot more quantitative. For example, I forgot to mention that the red list doesn't just list species as either threatened or endangered. They actually have 5 different categories that they put species into. That includes least concern, so those are not vulnerable at all. Least concern, near threatened, vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered. So they classify species into those 5 groups. And they use these 4 criteria, including population reduction. So that includes both historical reduction and any predicted reduction that might occur. So for example, a loss of 80% of a population size qualifies a species as being critically endangered. Similarly, they use population size. So if a species has small population size and there's been observed decline in that population size or high fluctuations, then it may also qualify. Same thing for range size. Small range size combined with decline and fluctuation qualifies for a species. And finally, you can also use probability of extinction, which is what Margaret was talking about. It's basically a demographic model that predicts how likely a species is to become extinct in a certain extent of time. Okay, so as you can see, it is much more quantitative. However, it's not a perfect system. There have been critics of the IUCN system. For example, why is it that 80% reduction qualifies rather than 75%? So maybe those thresholds are a little arbitrary. However, it's definitely overall a lot more consistent across species and more transparent. So to just summarize that part quickly, in terms of listing, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service uses a mostly threat-based assessment process, whereas the red list species uses a more demographically based and quantitative process. However, the red list does not have a comparable process or formal process for how to remove a species from the red list. However, recovery is required for the Fish and Wildlife Service's endangered species. Currently, the way that the service implements recovery is a lot more difficult to see what their process is based on just reading through the documents. such as the recovery plans. It doesn't seem to be a clear-cut, consistent process that they apply to every species. Hopefully they're using some kind of combination of a threat-based analysis and a quantitative analysis, but it's not clear. And so that's basically the focus of my work. I'm interested in understanding how and to what extent science comes into recovery planning process. And the recovery planning process is in itself a socio-environmental system, because it requires the recovery planning team to not only consider the ecological factors associated with the species, but also the social factors and how those species interact with human activities. So for example, under ecological factors, the recovery planning team might have to consider species biology, how long-lived the species is, what is the reproductive rate, those kinds of traits. Also abundance and trajectories, or population trajectories for the species. For example, if it used to be a really abundant species, but now it's rare, compared to a species that's always been rare and now it's slightly less rare, you might manage those species differently. Also habitat requirements. What is the geographic range of the species? How much area does it need? Those might be other considerations. On the social side, you can look at direct threats on the species. For example, if the species is used for resources or food or for materials, that might be a direct threat. Also, any recreational activities like hunting, that might be a direct threat. Indirect threats are a little bit more common, so anything that modifies their habitat, or like pollution, or something like water diversion might impact the habitat. So all of these need to be taken into consideration. So just to give you an example of what a recovery team might conclude, this is the recovery criteria for the golden paintbrush species taken from the recovery plan. The team decided that the species needs 20 stable populations to be deemed viable, and then each of those populations must have at least 1,000 individuals. Okay, so you would hope that those values came from some analysis of both these ecological and threat factors. But in reality, there's a set of even more complex social factors that are likely to be at play, including economic constraints, for example. How much does each of the management actions cost? Are more than 20 populations even feasible given maybe the property value of the area? Also political climates. Are endangered species a priority right now? Is this plan likely going to be approved under this administration? And also societal values. How important is it to the general public that we save this species, for example? And so in reality, it's probably a combination of all of these three types of factors that led to the team deciding that 20 populations is what's required. And so basically, as a first stab then, I'm trying to understand then how these two sets of factors contribute to recovery planning so that we can kind of infer what the role of the third set of factors might be. And so another reason why we might want to look at the relationships between ecological factors, threats, and the recovery goals is that if we do find relationships, then we can actually use those relationships to inform future planning. For example, if we find that species with large bodies and long lives require a certain number of populations in general for delisting, then in the future, if we have a species where maybe we don't know as much information about it, but we do know that it's long-lived and it's a large body size species, and maybe we can manage it similarly to those other species. So that sounds like a really simplistic idea, but actually that type of surrogate characteristic approach to recovery management comes up over and over again because of budget restraints. So any kind of analysis or information that would help reduce the costs of management, basically, is really beneficial. Okay, so the first step then is to just look at one of those components, look at how ecological factors relate to recovery planning. So to answer that question, I used a database of information from all of the recovery plans for all of the listed plant and animal species. So for each species, this was a part of a previous project that was funded by a Department of Defense grant. So for each of the species, we recorded information on the recovery criteria as well as biological traits and abundances of the species that we would relate to the recovery criteria. So in terms of abundances, we recorded from the plans any mention of historical numbers of populations that were known, the abundances at the time of listing and at the time of plan writing. So to analyze for the relationships between those recovery criteria and the biological traits, I used an analytical method called classification and regression tree analysis, particularly a type called random forest. And basically this type of analysis just recursively partition your data set into smaller and smaller groups that are similar in terms of the response. So for example, looking at this cartoon over here, if you're starting with your full data set up here, it is first split by this variable 1 into one group of 10 species, and then the remaining species are then split again based on variable 2 and variable 3 into 3 other groups. And so each of these groups will have similar values for the response variable. Does that make sense? Okay, and so this type of analysis has a lot of benefits. One is that it can handle a large number of predictors simultaneously. Normally in a traditional parametric regression method, you'll need a large number of observations to handle that many predictors, but you don't need to in this type of analysis. Also, you can have correlated and interdependent predictors, and that's fine. And in fact, these analyses are really good at teasing apart those interdependent relationships. So for example, in this data set, you don't see the importance of variable 2 until you tease apart the importance of variable 1. And so it's really good at understanding those relationships or visualizing those relationships. And then lastly, it doesn't make any assumptions on the underlying distributions of your variables. So you can use categorical variables, continuous variables, over-dispersed variables. It's all fine. Okay, so because of all of these benefits, this type of analysis is actually widely used across a variety of sciences, including all the way from genetic research to psychological studies. Okay, so I'm just going to show you the best fitting models, 2 of them, one for all of the listed plant species and one for all of the listed animal species. And again, the response variables are those delisting criteria. In this case, it's the number of populations that you need to delist a species. So for the plant species, the best predictors were abundances only. The other biological traits did not come out as significant. So to walk you through that tree again, imagine this is where all the data comes in. The species that have more than 29 populations at the time of listing, on average, require 55 populations to delist. So that's how you read that branch. And then other species that have fewer than 29 populations at the time of listing go on to be split again. And so the only significant variable that came in was the abundance at the time of listing. And the trend that you see is basically species that were less and less abundant require fewer and fewer populations for delisting. And so that might be sort of counterintuitive at first. You might think that species that have lower abundances should require more populations for delisting, right? Because they're more endangered. But this is probably where the normative assessments come in, because if you're a species that only has less than 8 populations, the service is probably not going to require 55 populations to delist a species, because it's not possible.
Would that take into account historical numbers also as much as possible?
Yeah,
So
as much as
it was always
possible.
like, as you said, the ones that were always rare
Right.
never had 55. So
Exactly.
why go for 50? That is?
Yeah, so for this one though, historical population abundances were included, but they didn't come out as significant.
How are the cutoff points chosen? Are they chosen by the model?
By the model, yep. Whatever splits splits the responses into the tightest groups, basically. Okay, so the results are actually the same for the animals, even though the tree looks a little more complicated. But basically, I'll just walk you through it. Again, the most important variables are mostly abundance variables, so numbers of populations at the time of listing, historically known, numbers of individuals historically known. So they're all abundances, and the trend is the same, where you have higher abundances leads to higher delisting criteria and all the way to the lowest ones. The only trait that did come in as important is adult mortality here. So species that have greater than 42% mortality rates tend to have higher delisting criteria than those with lower mortality. So that actually makes sense. Species that,
Among the subset.
Yeah, among the subset, right. Only those that have less than 5 populations at the time of writing, and then greater than 2.3 populations at the time of listing, yes. So then overall, that's the conclusion that I came up with from these analyses, that abundances do explain the delisting criteria, but biological traits probably not as important. Okay, so then the next step is to add in the threats. The way that threats are presented in the recovery plans, they're basically just in paragraph form. So they're in the species threat descriptions. For the example for this species, it's threatened by urban development, fragmentation, reduction of pollinators, fire suppression, and disturbances in small population sizes. So it's one of the problems with this is that from plan to plan, the language is not consistent. So they might be the same threats threatening several species, but they may be put in slightly different terms. And so the first step to incorporating the threats is just to come up with a standardized system for classifying these threats so that we can analyze these data. So what I did was I first started by using the IUCN threat taxonomy. So they do have kind of a classification scheme that's hierarchical. And so I applied them to the database of animals and plants that we have to see how well of a fit that is. And in general, it was a pretty good fit, except there were a lot of instances where I might have to shift around some of the categories and modify them, and also adding more specific categories to fit what the species were actually facing. And so I don't know if you can see that, but so in general, I came up with these 13 really broad categories of threats, and underneath each of those broad categories, there are more specific types of threats in each of them. So for example, for the habitat loss, underneath that we have whether the loss was due to agriculture conversion, infrastructure development, other types of reasons. So I'm not going to go over all of them, but basically it ranges from things like persecution, which are relatively rare, to things like human disturbance and habitat loss.
People don't like it?
Yeah, I guess so. I know.
Get rid of it.
Wolf, yeah, that's a good example, wolves. So, right. Okay, so for the complete classification, I've done it for the plants so far. I'm working on the animals, but that's become a little bit complicated because Animals, for example, include recreational hunting and fishing. And for that threat, currently I've put it under harvesting, but the other recreational activities are currently under human disturbance. So is that going to matter? Should I actually have recreation under accidental mortality? Those kinds of decisions I'm still working on. So once I have that, then I can go forward. But I have them for the plants so far, and I just did a quick analysis to update those analyses that I did before. So for this one, it's again for the population's numbers required for delisting. And I don't know if you remember, but basically this portion of the tree diagram is exactly identical to before, except for now when you have populations, or fewer than 8 populations at the time of listing, then infrastructure development comes in as important. So species that are threatened by infrastructure development tend to have lower delisting criteria on average than those that are not threatened by that. But the other thing to notice is the percent of variance explained. Without the threats, it was about 59% variance explained, and now it's basically 61%. So the increase in variance explained is very low, and so the amount of variance that we can attribute to threats is debatable in this case. However, maybe if I analyze them at the more detailed categories of threats, I might see different results. And also maybe for the animals, we might see different results. So I'm going to continue working on that. Okay, so then based on these analyses so far, it seems like these sets of factors do contribute some, at least, to recovery planning, especially the abundances and population trajectories. But actually, this diagram is a simplification. There is an additional step that's not depicted, and that is that these ecological factors and the threats are actually contributing to the species extinction risk. And hopefully that extinction risk is then what is informing the recovery planning process. Because you might think that species with higher extinction risk would maybe require higher recovery goals or a certain type of management. And then those other social factors are actually not directly affecting extinction risk, but they are impacting the recovery planning. And so if we're just looking at these two sets of factors, then we might actually be seeing, we might expect to see a stronger trend with extinction risk itself as compared to looking at the recovery criteria, because really these are one step removed. So what we really want to do, ideally, is to estimate extinction risk for those listed species so that we can then understand all of these different processes that are going on. However, for most of these listed species, we just don't have those data to estimate extinction risk. And so that's a problem that I'll come back to in a bit. However, there are a set of what I'm calling well-studied species for which there are data to estimate extinction risk for these species. And so we can use these kind of as surrogates to then estimate their extinction risk and test whether there is that relationship between traits and threats. So one of the reasons for looking at this is that if we do find that the relationships exist, then we can compare what we find to those relationships that we found earlier with the listed species, and any inconsistencies might be due to the recovery process. Additionally, again, if we do find these relationships, then we can use that as surrogate information to estimate risk for species that we don't have those data for. However, if we don't find the relationship, then maybe it just means that the analyses that we're using and the data type that we're including are not sufficient to detect those relationships, and that extinction risk might be so context specific that they need to be determined on a case-by-case basis. And maybe, in fact, the service is doing that, but we're just not able to pick that up using these analyses and the data that we have. If that's the case, then we really need alternative estimates of extinction risk that doesn't require such intense data availability to estimate in the traditional methods. So by the traditional methods, I just mean what are called population viability analyses or population projection models. These types of models to predict extinction risk basically require extensive amounts of demographic data. So by that I mean individual rates of survival, individual rates of fecundity, and also how those rates change over an individual's lifetime. So you need to monitor thousands of individuals over tens of years in order to really get at those rates. So for most species, we just don't have that. So, but we do for some. Again, for these well-studied species. So one of the other projects that I'm working on is to compile a database of these demographic data in the form of these matrix population models. And so when I have that database, then I can estimate extinction risk for these species. And then the next step would be then to predict extinction risk for those species and then compile the traits and threats and then relate them so that I can understand those relationships like in that top diagram I was showing you. So currently this part is partially completed. I have them again starting with the plants. For those I have the traits and the threat data, but the demographic matrix data are still currently being digitized, so I can't actually estimate extinction risk yet. However, for a portion of those species, the original studies reported population growth rates. So I actually did preliminary analysis using those growth rates because you would expect the growth rates to be negatively correlated with extinction risk because species that have faster growing populations should have a lower risk of extinction. So I'll show you some of those really quick. So for this, basically the way you read the population growth rates is on the y-axis. Values, growth rates that are greater than 1 indicate populations that are increasing or growing. Population growth rates less than 1 indicate declining populations, and growth rates equal to 1 indicate stable populations. However, for this analysis, basically there are no trends because so little variance is explained. I did another analysis where I grouped the species into either increasing, decreasing, or stable populations. And that came up with stronger relationships. For this one, we find that species that are threatened by invasive alien species tend to have more declining populations than species that are not. And then species that are not but are affected by intrinsic factors also tend to have more declining populations. So by intrinsic factors, here we're including everything from low genetic variation, low dispersal ability, that kind of thing. Okay. So based on those preliminary analyses and using just population growth rates instead of extinction risk, it's really not clear which one of these scenarios we're going to fall into once we actually calculate extinction risk. So I'm going to keep working on that. But regardless of which scenario we end up with, I think it's really worthwhile to investigate alternative methods for estimating extinction risk anyway. And that is because if we have ways to estimate extinction risk that doesn't require that extensive demographic data that I was talking about, then we can actually estimate them for those listed species, and we can complete this path diagram without doing the extensive monitoring. Does that make sense? Okay. And in fact, the Fish and Wildlife Service is really interested in having those alternative methods of assessing extinction risk. So currently they're developing something called the species status assessment, which is a framework that they're proposing to take all of the different available data for the listed species and combine them to assess species viability or extinction risk, conversely. So the considerations include past and current abundance and distribution of the species, what resources the species needs, what are the current and future predicted resource levels, what are the current and predicted stressors that are likely to affect the species. So, they want to combine all of these into an assessment of viability, and then the idea is that the conclusions of that assessment can then be used across the different programs that they have to inform the decisions, so that all the decisions that are about the same species would at least be based on the same analysis and the same data, which is great. So they currently have proposed ways to document and assess all of these different components, but the problem that they're having is then how do you actually translate these to extinction risk? And so part of my work as well is to look at some possible ways that we can do it. Oops. And so one of the ways that I'm thinking is actually we can use the species distribution data, in particular habitat configuration. So for most of the listed species, we can obtain a map of either the current or the historical distribution of the species, and we can measure the habitat configuration of the landscape. And there have been, from the literature, 3 different measures of species persistence that you can calculate based on habitat configuration. They're called predicted occupancy and metapopulation capacity. Those are metrics from Hanske's metapopulation theory. And the third one is a more recent model that predicts the proportion of population size loss based on the change in habitat configuration. I'm happy to talk more about how I calculate these if you're interested. So basically, the idea is then using those metrics so that we can compare different habitat scenarios to see how those scenarios are affecting species viability. So for example, you can compare alternative reserve designs, historical versus current versus predicted distribution of the species, and how potential threats might affect habitat. So I did a sample analysis applying those metrics to these 3 California species that are threatened by limestone mining. And so just to show you some example of the results, I'm only focusing on that 3rd metric. And I'm comparing 4 different habitat scenarios, 2 of which are management plans. One is the proposed critical habitat plan from the service. The Forest Service has their own management plan. Maximum mining, these are the threat scenarios. Maximum mining, where all the current mining claims are removed as habitat for the species, and minimum mining, where only the high quality ore is removed. And so just to show you some of those results. So it seems that the critical habitat plan is the best for all 3 species because the least amount of abundance would be lost, and the maximum mining is the best. And interestingly, the Forest Service plan in all cases performs less well than even the minimum mining scenario. And part of the reason is because the Forest Service plans tries to manage all 3 species at once with one plan, whereas the critical habitat plan plans for each species individually. And you can also compare these results with the IUCN Red List criteria. I mentioned that 80% of the population loss would equate to being critically endangered, and so the maximum mining would actually put all 3 of these species close to or above the threshold. Okay, so just to conclude, critics of the ESA have long contended that it's really difficult to understand where the science ends in the recovery planning process and where those normative judgments begin. And so my work is really to address the question of to what extent are recovery criteria based on science. And so at least based on these analyses, it seems that species management really is a combination of a biological and a social process, where they're trying to combine what is necessary for species survival with what is possible for that species based on the social context. So after I finish with this work, the next logical step would be obviously to explicitly look at those other social factors. And being here at SESYNC is going to really help me start exploring that. And secondly, I hope that my work will help to improve the transparency of the process. If the service would just include in their plans more explicitly how they're coming up with their decisions, I think it would make it a lot easier to defend them. And one way to do that is to just frame their decisions in terms of extinction risk. And so my work is showing that you can do that without having those demographic data. So thank you so much. I want to thank all my collaborators and some funding sources. I just want to tell everybody that apparently it's Endangered Species March Madness on the NOAA website, so you can go and vote for your favorite endangered species.
That means
See
that
which one survives.
If you had to choose between one of the two, then
I know.
you want to save.
That's right. Which one would you rather
Which one's
save?
more
It's funny. Yeah, so if you click on each of them, they give you like a little blurb on each of them, their candidate positions. It's really funny. So thanks.